The sun scorched the dry earth of the ranch, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked ground. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sun-baked hay, carried by the relentless desert wind. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the rhythmic sound of hooves against the dirt. The horses grazed peacefully behind the fence, their tails flicking lazily at the flies. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until she appeared. A young woman with golden hair walked along the dusty road, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each step carried a weight no one else could see. She wore simple athletic clothes, yet there was something about her that felt off. The air around her seemed to hum, an invisible force pulsing beneath the surface. Her eyes were sharp, cold, yet filled with something unspoken, something heavy. She locked eyes with the horses, and in that instant, everything changed. The reaction was immediate. The white horse was the first to sense it. His head shot up, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as if he had caught the scent of an unseen predator. His body stiffened, muscles tightening like coiled springs. Beside him, the dark horse took a hesitant step backward, snorting violently. There was something in their eyes, something unnatural. It wasn't fear. It wasn't rage. It was recognition. And then chaos. The white horse reared up, releasing a piercing, almost panicked whinny that shattered the stillness of the ranch. The dark horse spun on his hooves, his powerful legs kicking up clouds of dust. Both of them turned in unison, not to run away, but to charge. Straight toward the fence. Straight toward her. The white horse lunged first, his front legs lifting effortlessly off the ground. The barbed wire that should have stopped him meant nothing. He cleared it with unnatural grace, his hooves landing on the other side without a single misstep. The dark horse followed, launching himself over the fence as if it wasn't even there. The girl's mouth parted slightly, her eyes locked on the scene before her. They had never done this before. Never. And then, for just a brief moment, everything was still. The horses stood there, muscles trembling, chests heaving, dust swirling around their legs. But they didn't run. They didn't flee into the open desert. They were staring at her. And what she saw in their eyes made her blood turn to ice. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was something else. And then they started moving toward her. The girl's pulse hammered against her ribs. The world around her seemed to blur, swallowed by the eerie intensity of the moment. The horses, no longer bound by the confines of their enclosure, stood motionless for just a second longer. Their bodies trembled. Their breath came in short, powerful bursts. But their eyes, those eyes were wrong. She had grown up around horses, spent years understanding their instincts, their emotions. But she had never seen a look like this before. It was as if they knew something she didn't. Then they moved. Not in a frantic gallop. Not in the jittery, unpredictable way of startled animals. No, this was deliberate. A slow, measured approach, each hoofstep pressing into the dirt with an eerie certainty. The white horse led, its head slightly lowered, nostrils flaring, but its gaze never wavered. The dark horse followed just behind, his breath heavy and deliberate, his muscles coiled like a predator ready to strike. They weren't running away. They were coming straight for her. The girl took an instinctive step back, her boot kicking up a cloud of dust. She wanted to believe this was just panic, that something had spooked them, but deep down, she knew better. This wasn't fear. This wasn't instinct. This was intent. The horses walked in perfect synchronization, their bodies moving with an eerie grace, as if controlled by an unseen force. The air between them felt charged, thick with something unexplainable. Her breath came shallow as she took another step back. Her mind screamed at her to turn, to run, but something held her there. Something about the way they looked at her, as if waiting for her to understand. The white horse let out a slow, guttural exhale, its warm breath colliding with the cold sweat on her skin. The dark horse tilted its head slightly, almost as if observing her reaction. They were studying her. And then, the white horse stopped mere feet from her, its massive frame blocking out the sun. For the first time, she could see the depth of its eyes up close. They weren't just wild. They were knowing, as if a terrible, silent message was trapped behind them, desperate to be understood. The dark horse came to a halt just behind, his ears flicking slightly, sensing something she couldn't. Then, the white horse did something that made her blood run cold. It took one final step, so close she could feel the heat radiating off its body, and lowered its head until its muzzle was inches from her chest. Its breath was slow, steady, almost calculated. And then, it opened its mouth, just slightly, as if trying to speak. The girl's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. The white horse stood so close that she could feel the warmth radiating off its powerful body, the rhythmic rise and fall of its chest almost hypnotic. Its muzzle hovered inches from her, its nostrils flaring, as if drawing in her scent, studying her. The dark horse loomed just behind, its presence just as unnerving. The way they stood, the way they moved, was unlike anything she had ever seen. They weren't just animals anymore. They were something else. She wanted to move. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn and run, to put as much distance between herself and these creatures as possible. But her legs felt anchored to the ground, paralyzed by an invisible force. The silence around them had thickened, pressing against her ears, making the smallest sounds. Her own heartbeat, the rustling of dry grass, seemed deafening. The horses weren't just looking at her. They were waiting. But for what? Then it happened. A sound unlike anything she had ever heard rumbled from deep within the white horse's throat. It wasn't a whinny, nor a snort. It was something darker, something unnatural. Low and guttural, almost vibrating through the air like a distant echo. And within that sound, buried beneath layers of raw, unexplainable noise, she heard something else. A whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, like words trapped just beyond the veil of understanding. It was impossible, but she had heard it. Her blood turned to ice. She staggered back, her boots scraping against the dirt, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The white horse took a step forward, perfectly synchronized with her retreat. Its dark eyes locked onto hers. It was mirroring her, testing her reaction. The dark horse exhaled, a slow, deliberate breath that sent another ripple of dread through her body. It wasn't just watching. It was waiting for her to realize something. She turned sharply, her instincts finally snapping into place, her body screaming for her to flee. But the white horse moved faster. Its head jerked to the side, blocking her path with swift, unnatural precision. The movement wasn't random. It wasn't startled. It was intentional. The girl sucked in a trembling breath, her mind racing. These weren't just frightened animals. They knew something she didn't, and whatever it was, they weren't letting her leave. Then, just as the panic threatened to consume her, the wind shifted. The dry air carried with it something new, something subtle but unmistakable. The horse's ears twitched in unison, their bodies tensing. They weren't alone anymore. Someone or something was coming. The girl's heart slammed against her ribs as the air around her thickened. The eerie silence that had consumed the moment was now broken by something far more unsettling: footsteps. Distant, deliberate, crunching against the dry earth. They weren't fast. They weren't frantic. They were measured, steady, approaching. The horses reacted instantly. Their bodies stiffened, muscles coiling like springs ready to snap. The white horse's ears flicked toward the sound, its nostrils flaring as if trying to catch a scent. The dark horse shifted slightly, its hoofs pressing deep into the dirt, its breath heavy and controlled. They knew who was coming, or worse, they had been expecting it. The girl swallowed hard, her mouth dry as sandpaper. She turned her head slowly, every nerve in her body screaming that she shouldn't, that she didn't want to see what was there. But the compulsion was too strong. She had to know. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the weight of them vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. And then she saw it, a figure, just beyond the heat-distorted horizon. Something was emerging from the dust. At first, it was nothing more than a shifting shadow, its form blurred by the waves of desert heat. But as it drew nearer, its shape became clearer, too clear. A man, dressed in dark, tattered clothes, walking with an unnatural ease through the barren landscape. There was something wrong with the way he moved. His strides were smooth, too smooth, as if his feet weren't truly touching the ground. The girl's breath hitched. A primal fear clawed at her throat, urging her to run. But the horses didn't move. They stood their ground. The white horse took another step forward, positioning itself protectively in front of her, while the dark horse shifted to her side, as if blocking any possible escape. They weren't letting her leave, but they also weren't letting him through. Then the man stopped, not at a distance, not far enough. He was close now, close enough that she could see his face. Except there was no face, just a blur, an emptiness where features should have been. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow, shifting void. The air around him crackled, thick with something unseen, something wrong. The girl's body locked in place, every fiber of her being screaming at her to move, to flee, to do anything but stand there and watch. But before she could react, before she could even take a breath, the white horse suddenly reared up on its hind legs, letting out a scream unlike anything she had ever heard. It wasn't a whinny, it was a warning. The white horse's scream tore through the silence like a blade, sharp and unnatural. It wasn't the panicked cry of a startled animal. It was something deeper, something primal. The sound sent a violent shudder through the girl's body, rattling her bones. The dark horse joined in, stamping its hooves against the earth, its breath coming in harsh, aggressive bursts. They were trying to drive something away. The faceless figure didn't flinch. It stood perfectly still, as if untouched by the horse's fury. The air around it shimmered, bending unnaturally, like heat waves distorting reality itself. It wasn't human, couldn't be. No person could stand so close to two massive, enraged animals and remain completely unfazed. The girl's breath came in short, rapid bursts. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to turn and disappear into the dust, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever this thing was. But the horses were blocking her, not restraining her, protecting her. It was clear now. They weren't acting strangely out of fear. They had sensed this thing before she did, and they had broken free not to attack her, but to stand between her and it. The white horse pawed at the ground, nostrils flaring, eyes wild with a fire she had never seen before. The dark horse let out a slow, guttural exhale, shifting its weight as if preparing to lunge. They were ready to fight, but the figure didn't react. It didn't move, simply stood there as if waiting, watching, or perhaps listening. Then it spoke, not in words, not in any sound she could recognize. It was a vibration, low, deep, like the distant growl of a storm building on the horizon. It resonated through the ground, through her chest, through her very bones. She felt it more than she heard it. The white horse reared again, screaming even louder, its muscles taut with fury. The dark horse pressed its body closer to hers, shielding her from something unseen. The girl's body shook. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to wake up from whatever nightmare she had stumbled into. But before she could do anything, the faceless figure took a step forward. Just one step, and the world around them shifted. The moment the faceless figure stepped forward, everything warped. The heat of the sun remained, but its warmth felt wrong, distant, artificial, as if the sky itself had been painted over with something hollow. The wind that had carried the scent of dust and hay through the air vanished entirely, leaving an eerie stillness in its place. The world was no longer the same. The girl felt it in her bones, a sensation like stepping onto unstable ground, except nothing had moved. Nothing except that thing. The horses reacted instantly. The white horse, usually a creature of measured strength, exploded into motion. It reared up, its hooves slashing through the empty air. Its scream so powerful it sent tremors through the earth beneath them. It wasn't fear that fueled the beast. It was rage. The dark horse wasn't far behind, muscles coiling as it pressed itself closer to the girl. Not to restrain her, to shield her. Their breath came in short, controlled bursts, but their bodies remained tense, locked in place like sentinels standing against an unseen force. the figure didn't flinch. It didn't react at all. It remained perfectly still, as though its form wasn't bound by the same rules as everything else in this world. Its head tilted, just slightly, a precise mechanical movement that sent a fresh wave of ice through the girl's veins. Even without eyes, she could feel it studying her, measuring her. A force she couldn't see wrapped itself around her limbs, tightening like invisible hands pressing into her skin. She tried to move, tried to scream, but nothing happened. She was locked in place, bound by something beyond comprehension. The white horse moved first. Not in fear, not in hesitation, in attack. It lunged forward, a blur of raw muscle and fury, hooves pounding against the cracked earth. The ground itself seemed to shake with the force of its charge, a cloud of dust exploding behind it. It was going to strike that thing, but just before impact, the figure twitched. Not a normal movement, not human, a sharp, unnatural jerk of its form, as though something had glitched inside its very existence. And then it stepped back. The shift was instantaneous. The crushing weight that had paralyzed the girl vanished. The force that had held her in place evaporated like mist burned away by the sun. Her body lurched backward, and she gasped, actually gasped. It felt as if she had been drowning and only now remembered how to breathe. She staggered, her knees nearly buckling. But before she could fall, the dark horse's massive head pressed firmly against her, grounding her, holding her up. She wasn't alone. And that's when it hit her. The horses weren't running away. They weren't confused. They had known what this thing was before she had even seen it. They weren't acting out of instinct. They were fighting it. But why? And how did they know? The girl's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, her body still shaking from the unnatural force that had held her captive. Even though she was free now, the sensation of being watched, controlled, measured still lingered like an invisible chain around her limbs. Her knees felt weak, unsteady, but before she could collapse, the dark horse pressed against her side, its massive frame solid and unyielding. The warmth of its breath, the slow and steady rise of its chest, it was real. It was the only real thing she could trust in that moment. The white horse remained in front of her, standing like a guardian of an ancient battlefield. Its muscles were tense beneath its gleaming coat, nostrils flaring with each deep, controlled breath. But it wasn't looking at her. It was focused on the figure. The faceless entity had not moved since stepping back, its hollow form still distorting the air around it. The girl's breath caught as she realized the horses had made it retreat. They had stopped something that moments ago had felt unstoppable. But why? How? The figure showed no signs of fear. It had no expression, no visible emotions. And yet, it had reacted. It had sensed them, recognized their defiance. The girl's fingers curled into fists as she fought to make sense of what was happening. The horses weren't just acting on instinct. They knew something. They had recognized this thing before she had even seen it. Had they encountered it before? Had it come for them before it came for her? A cold shiver ran through her spine at the thought. Then, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, a sudden gust of wind tore through the silent landscape. The dust swirled violently around them, the dry earth twisting into chaotic patterns before settling again. The world felt different, as if something had shifted beneath the surface, unseen but undeniable. The dark horse let out a long, slow exhale, its breath vibrating against her skin. The white horse stomped once, a sharp, commanding motion, as if waiting for her to understand. Then, without warning, the figure moved. Not toward her, away. Slowly, deliberately, its form shimmered in the hazy heat, its edges flickering like a mirage. The girl's stomach twisted as she realized it wasn't simply disappearing. It was stepping back into something. Something she couldn't see. Something beyond the edges of her understanding. And just before it was gone, she felt it again. That terrible pressure in the air, the silent whisper crawling beneath her skin. It wasn't retreating. It was watching. And for the first time, the girl knew with absolute certainty. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. The girl's breath shuddered as the last traces of the figure dissolved into the horizon. The air around her felt lighter, no longer thick with that crushing, invisible force. And yet, the weight of its presence lingered, like the ghost of a hand that had just released its grip from her throat. Even though it was gone, was it really gone? Her skin prickled as if something unseen still hovered nearby, just beyond the veil of perception. The horses didn't relax. The white horse stood tall, muscles tense, ears still pinned back, nostrils flaring as it stared at the spot where the entity had vanished. The dark horse remained at her side, unmoving, its breath still slow, controlled, waiting. They didn't chase after it. They didn't return to the fence. They knew something she didn't. They understood something about this thing that she had yet to grasp. And that terrified her more than the encounter itself. Swallowing against the dryness in her throat, she forced herself to take a step forward. The moment her boot touched the dirt, a strange electric sensation crawled up her leg. The ground was different. It looked the same, cracked and sunbaked beneath the relentless desert sun. But something about it felt wrong, as if it had been altered by the presence of whatever had stood there just moments ago. She crouched down, hesitating, then pressed her fingers lightly into the soil. A jolt of cold shot up her arm, unnatural, piercing through her like a silent scream. She jerked her hand away, heart pounding. The ground was still warm from the sun, except for that one spot. That patch of earth was ice cold, as if all warmth had been drained from it, consumed by something that had no place in this world. The horses reacted the moment she touched it. The dark horse let out a deep, uneasy snort, shifting on its hooves, while the white horse took a half-step closer, lowering its head. Not in fear, but in warning. The message was clear: don't touch it again. A shiver crawled down her spine as she rose to her feet, wiping her hand against her jeans, desperate to rid herself of the lingering chill. She turned back to the horses, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. What the hell was that? The white horse exhaled sharply, tilting its head slightly, as if it understood the question. But no answer came, only the endless stretch of desert and the cold, empty space where something unnatural had stood. The silence around her felt heavier than before, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The warm desert air pressed against her skin, yet she couldn't shake the ice-cold sensation creeping up her spine. Her fingers still tingled from where they had touched the lifeless patch of earth, and no matter how many times she rubbed them against her jeans, the feeling wouldn't fade. It was as though something had clung to her, burrowed into her skin, refusing to let go. She lifted her gaze to the horses. They hadn't moved. The white horse stood like a guardian, its gaze locked onto hers with unnerving intensity. The dark horse remained pressed against her side, its steady breathing the only thing tethering her to reality. But something had shifted. The way they looked at her, it wasn't the same anymore. There was something else in their eyes now. Not just wariness, not just tension, understanding, recognition, as if she had stepped beyond some invisible threshold, as if she had been chosen. A lump formed in her throat. Her voice was barely audible. You knew, didn't you? Neither horse flinched. They didn't react the way animals should. No startled movement, no restless shifting. They remained perfectly still, their massive bodies motionless except for the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of their chests. That was her answer. They had known all along. They had seen this thing before. Maybe not this exact one, maybe not here, but somewhere. This wasn't new to them. And yet, they had not run. They had stayed. They had fought. Her pulse pounded painfully in her ears. 100 questions flooded her mind, crashing over one another like a raging tide. How many times had this happened? How many others had stood in this exact place, feeling what she was feeling now? Had they all survived? And the most terrifying question of all, why had it been her this time? She turned slowly, her breath caught in her chest as she looked back toward where the figure had disappeared. The dust had settled. The sky still burned with the fading glow of the sun, but something about that spot was wrong. The air there still felt heavy, as if the world itself was struggling to return to normal. Then her eyes landed on something in the dirt, just beyond the scuffed patches where the horses had struck the ground. footprint, her stomach twisted. Not a hoof print, not an animal track. A single, deep footprint pressed into the cracked earth. Faced her. A chill shot through her veins. It hadn't just been watching her. It had been walking toward her. The girl's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she stared at the footprint in the dirt. It was deep, pressed with unsettling precision into the cracked, sun-baked earth. Facing her. Not angled away, not a random mark in the dust. It had been moving toward her. Her pulse pounded violently in her ears. Every second she had stood frozen in place, trapped by that unseen force. It had been getting closer. The realization made her skin crawl, as if invisible fingers had brushed against the back of her neck. But then, for reasons she still couldn't comprehend, it had stopped. The entity had chosen to step back, disappearing into the heat-distorted horizon instead of completing whatever it had intended to do. Why? She forced herself to look away from the footprint, turning instead to the white horse. It stood motionless, towering over her like a guardian. Its ears still pinned back, its chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. The dark horse remained close, so close she could feel its warmth against her arm. A stark contrast to the unnatural chill still lingering in her fingertips. They weren't just animals caught in something beyond their understanding. They had been part of this fight. A gust of wind surged across the open land, kicking up a swirling veil of dust around them. The world should have felt normal now. The entity was gone. The crushing force that had held her in place had vanished. But she knew better. It had left something behind. Not just its footprint, not just the cold void in the earth where it had stood. It had left its presence. She could still feel it, lingering just beyond the edges of her perception. Watching, waiting. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She had spent her life working with horses, understanding their instincts, their silent warnings, the way they reacted to things that humans were too slow to notice. But this was different. This wasn't fear. This wasn't confusion. This was knowledge. The white horse had sensed that thing before she ever saw it. The dark horse had moved to shield her before she even understood why she needed protection. They had known. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. What now? The words felt foolish the moment they left her lips. What was she expecting? A response? A sign? But the white horse only let out a slow, deliberate exhale, as if it had been waiting for her to ask. Then, without hesitation, it took a step forward. The dark horse followed, nudging her shoulder. Not in fear, but in purpose. They weren't running. They weren't retreating. They were leading her somewhere. She hesitated. One last time, she turned back toward the footprint, toward the empty space where the figure had stood. Was it really gone? Or was it just watching from a distance, waiting for the right moment to return? The wind howled through the open land, carrying with it a single, undeniable truth. This wasn't over.